Having good B-roll will elevate the quality of your video immensely, but having lots of high-quality B-roll will make your life a whole lot easier when it comes time to edit. So here's a quick guide, some tips and tricks and best practices on how to get good B-roll. These are based on the work I've been doing for the past few months, helping my latest client generate well over 100,000 views across TikTok and Instagram in under 6 weeks. Now, the first thing to understand is that B-roll is fundamentally a tool. It's an asset you can use in your editing for 3 main purposes, and it is very useful to keep those in mind when filming. Firstly, like we all know, is of course demonstration, so showcasing the things that are being talked about in your videos, making it easier for viewers to understand. Second function, of course, retention, keeping your videos interesting, either by just having straight up interesting B-roll footage, or to just get a change of scenery to keep viewers' attention. Thirdly is a very under-discussed function of your B-roll footage, which is pacing. You can use B-roll footage to control the flow of your video in your edit. This works so long as your B-roll footage fits the aesthetic and theme of your video and is simple enough to where it's not confusing to your viewer. As you progress as an editor, you'll find yourself using this function a lot more. Before we get into our list of tips on how to get that great professional looking B-roll footage, I want to quickly touch on my main piece of advice around filming B-roll, and that is to film a lot of B-roll. So what a lot of people will do is they'll go out and they'll film their functional B-roll, their demonstrative B-roll, like we talked about, showcasing things talked about in your video, but then they'll leave it there. If you do this right, your specific pre-planned B-roll will end up actually being a very small portion of the total B-roll you're going to film. When you're editing, it is crucial to have a large library of B-roll content, and not all of it needs to be super specific to what is being explained. Because as I mentioned, your B-roll will be serving more functions than just demonstration. So when you do go out and film your B-roll for your clients, plan out all the specific shots you want, demonstrating, for example, products or facilities or processes or your subject doing a certain action. But in between these main clips, make sure you're getting a bunch of extra footage of things you might not at first think are relevant. Things like your subject just standing there, on a phone call, talking with another person, especially these human-to-human interaction ones are going to be very useful. Walking in and out of an elevator, sitting there and working. When I was starting out, I would tend to grab a lot of these just in case, but found myself using them a lot when it came down to editing. A good example of this, I was working with a client and we were at an event he was taking part in organizing. In between him doing his job running the event, we were taking clips of him talking for future videos. In addition to this, however, I was also just following our client around with a camera, grabbing random clips of him talking to people, running the event, as well as him just looking around and so forth. Now, what ended up happening is that because of the noise at the event, most of the talking head footage we took was totally unusable. However, we still ended up walking away with a ton of usable B-roll footage, turning it to a semi-successful shoot. And finally, get lots of different angles of the same thing. You would be surprised by how much you're going to be going back and reusing the same B-roll footage in your edits. So just having a tiny bit of difference in distances and angles between them will allow you to reuse this footage without getting too repetitive. So the key here is to grab a lot of B-roll footage, but if that B-roll footage isn't any good, it isn't usable, then what's the point? This method requires that you're consistently able to shoot high-quality, good-looking footage. So here's a list of tips that I've found that help you do that. Number 1, and possibly most important, location, location, location. When you're going around pointing and shooting B-roll content, you're not able to control environmental factors in the same way if you were setting up a longer shoot. Most crucially, lighting and backgrounds. So make sure to choose a location in which these factors consistently work in your favor. Of course, depending on the kind of client you're working with, you won't always have control over this. But when you do get to choose your location, make sure A, it matches the theme of your client and what they're talking about in their videos, and secondly, try to choose somewhere with good lighting. For this, I recommend avoiding super bright overhead lighting, as well as places that are just too dark. For example, take a look at this clip. This is one of those random filler clips I took of my client between talking head shoots. Now, I have no lights on him, but because of the color and angle of the lights at our location, in addition to a little bit of rim lighting coming from a nearby window, we're able to get this clip that looks like it's straight off of a movie set. Now, on the topic of lighting, let's talk about it real quick. Lighting is probably the most important aspect in making your clips look professional and cinematic, hence the emphasis on it when talking about location. Now, if you are fortunate enough to be using an external light source when shooting, here's a couple of things to consider. Firstly, getting good lighting in your scene is not just about flooding your subject with as much light straight on as possible. If the lighting of your environment isn't sufficient, you may be left with no options. Now, when lighting up a subject, you can try light from different angles to get different effects and moods. The basics of lighting angles are pretty simple, but you can get very complex as you go along. So it's worth checking out some YouTube tutorials to get down the basics, especially when it comes to lighting up human faces. But my number one quick hack for using your lighting for maximum effect when you're shooting your B-roll content is don't neglect rim lighting. Rim lighting is when your subject is lit up from behind to give them that sort of glow around their rim, hence the name. This separates your subject from the background, giving you that illusion of sharpness and gives it that real cinematic professional look. If you have only one light with you, it's often worth it to use your environment mainly to light up your subject and then reserve your light for rim lighting. This is again why your location is so important, because good lighting in your environment will afford you the flexibility to be able to play around with stuff like this. Tip number 3 is to give it some space. So one of the most common mistakes I see people making is consistently having their subject right up against a wall or a backdrop of some sort. This makes your image appear flat and just generally unprofessional. So what you want to do is to have a good amount of space behind your subject so that on film they are separated from the background. This not only helps your viewer focus on your subject, but also makes your image appear clearer and therefore higher quality. This also helps by having your background out of focus and therefore creating that blurred background look, aka bokeh, which again makes your video look far more professional. To cap things off, let's go through some quick-fire tips on camera settings. Now, oftentimes, especially if you're shooting with a phone, you're going to be shooting automatic, and you might not necessarily be able to affect all of these settings, but these are still good things to keep in mind when filming. Firstly, white balance. This is going to be automatic a lot of the time, but if you can affect it, make sure when you're indoors, crank it way cold to avoid that yellow backrooms look, and vice versa if you're outside, crank it way warm to avoid your footage looking like it's straight out of a horror film. 2. Slow it down. Slowing your footage down helps it look a lot smoother. When I'm shooting B-roll, because I want to be able to get lots of shots in quick succession, I'm often shooting handheld, which tends to include a little bit of camera shake. So slowing your footage down helps get rid of a little bit of that camera shake and makes it manageable to the point where it can be taken care of by almost any stabilization feature in your editing software. So I tend to shoot in 50 frames per second and then slow it down to 25 in my edits. But even if you're not able to crank up your frame rate, I still recommend slowing down your footage in editing. Most video editing softwares have interpolation features with which you can make your footage look smooth in slow-mo even if you don't have a high frame rate on it. Number 3. Aperture settings. Having an open aperture, aka a small number, again helps with getting that blurry background look, which is one of the easiest ways to make your footage look professional. And finally, focal length. Try shooting with a longer focal length, aka a more zoomed in shot. Most footage we see today is shot with very wide angles because people are filming with their phones, which are of course made to capture as much as possible in a scene. But if you're able to, try mixing in some tighter shots with longer focal lengths. This is closer to what we're used to seeing in movies, for instance, so it looks more professional and cinematic, but it also gives a more realistic representation of what we're seeing because your image isn't being distorted by the wide angle. This is especially important when dealing with human subjects because, again, you'll avoid distorting facial features, so take a step back, zoom in, and make your client look good. So that should have most of your bases covered for getting a solid B-roll. This is by no means a complete guide to the principles of filmmaking and videography, but these are the main things I've seen that will make your footage stand out as pro quality and separate you as a professional. This, like all things, of course requires practice, and it will be more difficult and time-consuming to set up professional-looking shots starting out, but the more you work with it, the more it will become an automatic process, and eventually you can just focus on content and your footage will come out looking great automatically.